Welcome to Square Notes, the Sacred Music Podcast. Your chance to learn about the teachings of the Catholic Church on sacred music, both in theory and practice. Through interviews, discussions, and music, your hearts and minds will be lifted up and better understand what it means to sing the praise of His glory. And now, your host, Dr. Jennifer Donaldson-Novitska.
Hello, listeners, and welcome to Square Notes, the Sacred Music Podcast, the official podcast of the Catholic Institute of Sacred Music. It's season 6. Thanks for listening, and we look forward to a great season with wonderful guests and interesting topics. Today's episode is on the practical side as we talk about salaries for church musicians, terms of contracts, and working relations between clergy and musicians. I'm delighted to be joined by my wonderful colleague from the two seminaries, St. John in Boston, Michael Olbash. For 25 years before becoming a seminary music director, he held positions in churches in the Boston area, building excellent programs of sacred music for both children and adults. Before we get to the episode, I'm excited to announce our summer 2024 term at the Catholic Institute of Sacred Music. We're offering 9 classes taught by 6 amazing faculty members, again this summer with free tuition. Course topics range from history and principles of sacred music to teaching Gregorian chant to children, which is an introduction to the Ward method first level, introduction to chant, 4 advanced seminars in chant, and our outstanding choral institute, which will feature a 32-voice auditioned choir gathering to rehearse and sing for daily lauds, mass, vespers, and a salve, alongside instruction on running a great parish choir rehearsal. Courses will fill up fast, so don't wait to apply. Visit our website at catholicinstituteofsacredmusic.org and click on summer courses. And now, on to the interview. So, our topic today is perhaps a thorn in the side of clerics and musicians alike: contracts and salaries. And as a fellow director of music at a seminary, I'm sure you, like I, do hear complaints about clergy from musicians and complaints about musicians from clergy. And, these other sort of related HR issues that clergy have to deal with that are really, not really what they went into the priesthood for. And in addition to that unique perspective, you've done a lot of work at parishes and schools all around the Boston area. So all that to say, thanks for being here to discuss this rather problematic issue with me today.
Happy to be here with you, Jennifer.
So let's start by laying some foundations. What would you say are reasonable expectations that musicians can have about what working for the church and compensation for that work look like? I'm thinking here in terms of workload, standard of living, stability in a position, etc.
Well, the question of standard of living is going to vary greatly based on the musician's level of education and training and whether the position is full-time, part-time, or per service. And I'm sure we'll get into that as our discussion goes further. But that being said, musicians should be able to expect the same terms of employment that one would expect from any employer. Things like a salary, health insurance, paid vacation, sick leave, retirement, a clearly articulated job description, and a clear understanding of what the budget that the musician will be working with to effectively perform the agreed upon tasks. Everything from tuning the organ to paper for the copy machine. These things all cost something, and a musician should know going into it how much they can spend. A musician and pastor should also arrive at a mutually agreeable understanding of how the position is going to unfold in the future, how the musician's performance is going to be evaluated, how the salary would be adjusted to cost of living and merit and other market factors, how to go about implementing changes to the job description, and how long the employment relationship should last and what those expectations are. But beyond those nuts and bolts of any employment relationship that you would have in the secular world, there are also specific things to working for the Roman Catholic Church that a musician should be able to expect. One is the musician should expect to have the full support for carrying out the responsibilities of the position in accordance with the precepts articulated by the Church's magisterium. I often joke that the Catholic Church is one of the places where you can work and follow the rules and get fired for it. So one needs to have a very clear understanding from the get-go of what that is going to be in any situation. There should be an opportunity to fully integrate into the spiritual life of the parish. There should be an understanding about the employee's ability to attend Mass and adoration and spiritual direction, have time built in for prayer and retreats. A Roman Catholic musician should also be in professional organizations, such as the Church Music Association of America, which we
hypothetically speaking.
Well. Yes. And there are some others as well for different specialties. Subscriptions to professional journals and funding and time off for continuing education. So those are some of the major points that a musician could expect.
So the other side of the coin, of course, is what is it reasonable for a pastor to expect of a musician? And what should he, in addition to being able to expect from that person and their work themselves, what should he expect that music position to look like in terms of the financial burden on the parish and figuring that into his overall budget?
Sure. Before a pastor hires a musician, it's important that he steps back and evaluates where the parish has been in terms of sacred music and how he would like to use a professional musician to assist him in executing the pastoral duties of the parish. He should probably reread the general instruction of the Roman Missal and think and pray about how this new musician will be able to be an extension of his own ministry, using a particular set of skills to bring about the authentic and beautiful worship of God in his community. After all, that's what we're all about. A pastor should expect the financial burden of a sacred music program to be significant, and that the worship of God is the most important thing we do as a parish.
And you mean it's not boilers? It's not boilers and toilets?
Imagine that. It's not roofs. Yeah. It's not the video screen. Because the Eucharist is the source and summit from which all other aspects of parish life draw their purpose, a good rule of thumb is that a parish ought to spend about 15% of its budget on sacred music. Now, it could be as little as 10, it could be as much as 20, but I think 15% is a decent rule of thumb. And that would include salaries, benefits, and ancillary expenses. So a wealthy urban parish with a $3 million budget might be able to hire 2 or 3 full-time employees and some per diem musicians to execute a high-quality sacred music program. But a small rural parish that has a $50,000 a year budget might only be able to afford a part-time musician, or they may even opt to use what little funds they have to invest in training volunteers. So they may exercise their ministries effectively. I think it's also important for a pastor to remind himself that he is first and foremost a pastor of souls and not a foreman on the job site, not a business executive. And that's okay. He should be able to ask for help when he goes into a hiring and firing situation. He should be sure to have a basic understanding of employment law in his state and take the time to contact the human resource department at the diocese, because they have all sorts of advice for pastors on best practices in terms of writing contracts and what to do when hiring, things like that. So I don't think I mentioned what he could expect from a newly hired musician, so maybe I can talk about that a little bit.
Yeah.
I think a musician could be expected to conduct choirs, 1 or more choirs, including the recruitment and the rehearsals and the training necessary to bring those choirs into being. Musician could be expected to play the instrument at the parish, hopefully a pipe organ, be able to accompany hymns, psalms, anthems, provide preludes, postludes, improvisations as needed. Musicians should be able to arrange or compose music to suit particular circumstances, attend regularly scheduled meetings with the pastor, with the rest of the parish staff. A musician should select and practice the music, maintain a music library, tend to the maintenance of instruments, consult with families for weddings and funerals, interact with the parish school, the religious education program, the youth ministry, to tap into children so that they may be instructed in sacred music. They may create and copy worship leaflets, and they would need to be aware of what sort of copyright permissions are necessary to be obtained, what royalties need to be paid, training volunteers, hiring professional musicians. So you can see a very part-time person could not possibly do all of those things. And sometimes the pastor needs to evaluate what's most important and let some of these other things go.
Right. And so, I mean, this is also just important in terms of understanding what a musician really does. It's not just the time that the pastor sees them in the office or sees them at mass on Sundays, which is, the common misconception that's the hours that they should get paid for when they're actually showing up and doing the work of playing for mass or singing for mass, conducting, etc.
Absolutely. One of the things that I think is important is the puttering around time, if you will. Sometimes a musician just needs a few hours of quiet to consider ideas and generate these things and study and interact with colleagues. These are the things that spark creativity that something very special can come out of. And you just can't put a price tag on that or expect it to be done in a certain set number of hours.
And just a couple of follow-ups too, and about what a pastor can expect in terms of the musician's essentially moral conduct, right? That he can have a reasonable expectation that, the person is, he's either hiring a practicing Catholic to contribute to that mission of the parish, hiring for mission, or someone who, if they're not Catholic, has, standards of conduct that are so professional as never to offer scandal or detraction from the prayer.
Absolutely. He should be able to expect that the musician will be a practicing Catholic, or at the very least willing to fully commit to living a life that does not conflict with Catholic teaching. There is plenty of court cases that have happened where people have been fired for any number of personal habits or activities that they do in their life, and the courts have stood with the church on this, that they are able to discriminate in this way because they should not be required to keep an employee who is not living a life that is in sync with the Catholic faith. But this should be made up front in the advertising, in the initial interview, because not all musicians applying for a job in a parish understand this. And so the pastor should be able to charitably make that clear from the outset. Right.
And so another question about expectations. Is it reasonable for a priest who has a full-time musician and has, maybe a parish group comes to him and says, look, we want this big mass to happen and it's like a month away. And then the pastor, is it reasonable for him to occasionally, ever or never, go to the musician and say, look, this isn't the usual sort of thing you do, but we need music for these extra things? How much extra can a priest ask and is reasonable, especially if he's got someone on salary, and how much becomes too much?
I think it is reasonable for a pastor to ask the musician to do these things as long as those occasional items are listed in the contract and agreed upon beforehand. Any parish musician that's worth a salt will know that these things do come up and should want them to be beautiful and should want to put in the effort to make them musically pleasing and beautiful. How much is reasonable is the question. I think if it's once a month or once every couple of months, like you're saying, that's reasonable. If it becomes a regular feature or fixture of the job description, then I think you need to go back and reevaluate and renegotiate.
Right. So let's get into a little bit of the nuts and bolts, building on what we were just talking about now, and the distinction between full-time and part-time. I'm sure you, like I, have read many job descriptions, and some of them are very admirable and a lot are very cringy.
Yes.
And the main red flag is this delineation between full-time and part-time positions, So off the bat, if a priest is looking for a musician to do 5 masses on a weekend and have a choir, and he lists the job as part-time position, it's clear that there's a problem already in the conception of the position. So can you give some guidelines? Like, let's say that I've got a priest listening to this interview and he says, okay, how many hours Can I expect a musician to work? I've got 2 masses, blah, blah, blah. When you are thinking about the delineation between full-time and part-time, what are some criteria for, the number of ensembles versus the number of masses versus the number of hours in office that a priest can put together? Okay, this is clearly a part-time position. This is a full-time position, and have, a reasonable expectation there.
Yes. Well, I think most cases, the position should be full-time, even if it doesn't seem at first glance that the position could be filled in fewer than 40 hours a week. It's important to have a musician who's completely dedicated to the parish. Remember that a parish musician gives up almost every weekend, almost every holiday, not just a little bit, but a lot, taking time away from their families to make sure that other families have beautiful music when they come to worship God in their parishes. So almost every parish music position really ought to be full-time. I think back to one position I held for 11 years that only had one Sunday service, but I was responsible for 6 different ensembles through the week, handbells, 3 graded children's choirs, an accomplished adult choir that sang 2 or 3 meaty, substantial anthems every Sunday, many meetings and rehearsals throughout the week. And so that really was a full-time position. Pastors should also consider that a part-time musician is going to need to have another job in order to make ends meet, unless, that's not every circumstance, but if this is a head of household that you're hiring to serve as a parish musician, they're going to need to pay the mortgage and put meals on the table and send their kids to school and all of that. So that's why I say almost every parish should strive to offer a full-time position.
So let's talk a little bit about the hours in office. How much of a typical musician's work can really be done from home, versus what is a reasonable expectation that they're actually in the office doing that work? And how are some good ways that you've seen that spelled out in contracts or letters of employment?
Yes, I think pastor needs to decide how many hours he expects the musician to be on site.
Probably 40 is not the answer.
40 is not the answer. Some weeks it is in order to execute it well, but some weeks it's 10 in most situations. Think about your pastoral governance style. That would be my advice to a pastor. If you have a regularly set meeting with your musician every week or with your parish staff every week, it's reasonable to expect your musician to come in for that. Other pastors have this sort of more breezy style where they just want to be able to drop in the musician's office and find that the musician is there. And so they may want the musician to be on site 25, 30 hours a week, maybe even up to 40 hours a week. But that pastor needs to understand that he's going to need to give up something else that the musician would be doing at home. When I think of what I do at home in terms of managing volunteers, responding to emails, studying, looking over scores and practicing on my piano and fielding phone calls, all of these things that are much easier to do more effectively for some people at home. So I think it differs depending on the circumstance, but it should be clearly articulated from the beginning. I'm going to say that over and over again in this discussion, I'm sure, but to be honest, forthright, to have everything out in the open right from the get-go.
So let's talk a little bit about the qualifications and skills from one person that a priest can expect. Is it reasonable for a priest to expect that he'll find a director and an organist in one person? Or in some situations, let's say he has funds to do so, is he better off hiring 2 people for the role, possibly even at part-time? And, what are the sorts of pros and cons of keeping those roles in one person versus separating them into different people?
Sure. I think it's reasonable and very often necessary. I go back to that 15% figure that I quoted earlier, that 15% of the parish budget should go to music. Well, if you have a typical parish in the Archdiocese of Boston that has $300,000 budget, what's 15% of that? It's not going to be very much, 50 or 60,000. And let me tell you that you can't really live in Boston off of that as a full-time salary, but some people do. And so if you were to split that up into two, then you are going to have two or more part-timers who are potentially at a lower level of proficiency. So I think sometimes it's better for the pastor to have one qualified musician at a higher rate of pay than to split it into two positions. But the cons are that you can't really conduct as well from the console as you would with two arms standing up. Can't concentrate on the art of organ playing at 100% when you're constantly focusing on leading the ensemble. And in a large program, there just aren't enough hours in the week for one person to do both jobs effectively. Therefore, some aspects of the desired outcome would have to be forfeited, and the musician and pastor would need to negotiate what things can we do without. Can we do without a printed worship leaflet? Can we do without a children's choir? What things can we leave out because there just aren't enough hours in the day to get the job done?
So let's say a priest wants to hire a great music director. What are some key skills you'd ask him to look for, either in the experience or the educational background? And how does he write that into a job ad to actually get some good candidates to apply?
Well, I think it's important for a pastor to write into the ad things that are going to attract the best candidates. So describe the instrument, describe the choirs, whether it's choir that you currently have or the choir that you intend to develop. Describe the missalettes and hymnals in use. And are they going to continue to be in use, or do you want to move to something else? Say what that vision is. Describe the salary. And a little side note about salaries, there seems to be sort of a brick wall of a six-figure salary for a musician that pastors will not cross for some reason. And, every other aspect of life. I remember when I was a kid, back in prehistoric times, anyone who had a six-figure salary, well, they were the people who had the swimming pool in the backyard, and they were living large and driving Cadillacs. And it's not that much money anymore, to be honest. And with looking at the inflation that we've had just in the past couple of years. So I think pastors need to maybe train themselves to think differently about salary and compensation. I think a pastor, in terms of writing that ad, back to your original question, should be looking for a candidate with a certain academic degree, professional certification, or some demonstrated equivalent in terms of ability. Should be looking for experience. As we discussed, he should be looking for a Roman Catholic, living both a public and private life, which is in keeping with the precepts of the church. It's reasonable to say whether or not he would want an oath of fidelity to be signed by an employee. I would tell him to avoid words like vibrant and spirit of Vatican II, unless he wants a guitar strumming Yahoo, and spend a sentence or two articulating what your vision is as a pastor for the liturgy in your parish. The pastor should have that scent of the sheep and understand his people and know what his people need and what they can tolerate, how far he can bring them spiritually and liturgically, and try to articulate that in a sentence or two in the ad.
One of the things I talk about with my students frequently too is that, a person in this position really has to have some teaching skills, especially if they're working with volunteers. One of the hardest things to do is to get volunteers to sing well and to sing beautiful music well. And so, sometimes someone can have really impressive performance credentials and they can't teach their way out of a wet paper bag, and the whole situation's a disaster.
Yes, that's absolutely true. And that's a difficult one to find out just by looking at somebody's resume. But I think that's why having an audition process rather than just a sit-down interview is so important. Have your candidates, your finalists at least, run a rehearsal and observe how they interact with people for an hour or even just half an hour. How do they teach? How do they demonstrate different concepts? Do they run a rehearsal in a prayerful, jovial sort of way? Are they tyrants? Are they difficult? Do they have a short temper? It's amazing how many organists are have a reputation for having a short temper.
I can't figure at all what you're talking about, Michael.
I can't understand. We have the best job in the world. Why would people be grumpy about it?
Right, exactly. So, these conversations that a musician and priest are having in the interview and negotiation process, what are some other key elements? We've addressed a few of them, but what are some things that you think should be talked about in terms of vision, right? Because it seems like people can have different prudential senses of how to get to the goal, but if the goal is different, you're never going to be happy with that employment fit.
Oh, that's absolutely true. I don't think you should ever take a job or hire someone if you're thinking in the back of your head, well, I think I could probably relate to this person in the future, kind of, I guess. You should be of like mind from the start. I think you should discuss long-term and short-term expectations. It's important to know how long the musician expects to be employed at the parish, how long the pastor expects his assignment will be at the parish. These are important conversations to have. And you must have them at the beginning. I've walked away from many job offers myself because I've known in my heart that it was not going to work out. And it's so hard on all the parties involved, not just the musician and the pastor, but the parishioners. When a musician is fired or resigns in protest. So it's really important to be upfront and honest right from the initial conversations.
And do you think there's some way in which a conversation about stability can happen? Because, this process of changing pastors every 6 or 12 years, well, we can talk about the validity of that canonically, but that's the reality of a lot of situations. And, there are some things that a priest can do to set a musician up for success and not immediate firing, I think, upon the change of a pastorship. Do you think, what are some of the things that you've perhaps seen discussed in that regard to lend towards stability?
Well, I have seen good-natured pastors, knowing that they were going to be on their way out within a year or two, set up strongly worded contracts so that it would be difficult for the next pastor to terminate the employment situation. But unfortunately, at least here in Massachusetts, a church musician is an at-will employee. And as one of my colleagues delicately said, a contract is as good as the good intentions that went into developing it, but it really has no legal standing. So, and I think a pastor needs to be upfront with that because, again, musicians fresh out of conservatory, they don't really know what they're doing. They're not experienced with these situations and may not understand that nuance. On the other hand, I know many musicians who have worked for decades in the same parish under a revolving door of pastors, and they're able to continue to work. So it can be done.
So let's change gears a little bit and talk about weddings and funerals. And I'm wondering, what are some of the best compensation schemes that not schemes like as in scheming, but schemas that you've seen that are beneficial for both the parish and the musician in terms of adding some heft to the salary?
Yes. The last time I worked in a parish myself, we added an average number of funerals and weddings to my base salary. And it was just expected that I would play for all of the funerals and weddings. And I promote this method of doing things because I think we Catholic musicians sometimes look at a grieving family or a engaged couple. We sort of see them as a piece of meat. We start salivating. We want this extra income. We become mercenaries almost. And when it's just an expected part of your job and you get your paycheck is the same one way or the other, it takes away some of that. What's the word I'm looking for?
Subversive motives.
Yeah, perhaps. Yeah. And it allows you to deal with these people in a pastoral sort of way. It also has there's a positive financial aspect to it in that your retirement benefits will be calculated based on your base weddings and funeral rather than just your base. Some other benefits, many dioceses offer life insurance that's based on how much you earn for a salary. You want that to be as high as possible. So having it all rolled into one is something that I greatly advocate for. It also helps in situations where people want to bring other musicians in to play for a wedding or for a funeral. And if your paycheck is going to be the same one way or another, then you're not going to lose your temper getting upset about these other musicians coming in. You know that you're not going to lose on your paycheck. And many churches have what they call a bench fee, where if somebody wants to bring in an outside musician, they're expected to pay the bench fee to the resident musician. I think it's important for weddings and funerals to be paid directly by the church for many reasons. For one, the church has an interest in making sure that the musician is trained in the Catholic liturgy. And so that's a sort of way of making sure that you're going to be there, make sure that the liturgy is executed properly.
Yeah, well, if I could interject, this is a very different perspective from what I usually recommend to students, actually. And my perspective is that a parish can ensure a good salary for a musician if they can give, in the initial job advertisement, we have an average of such and such number of funerals, such and such weddings, and that composition would be in addition. And then it's, somehow being charged to the families. And so it's not skin off the back of the parish. And it's a way of supplementing the salary that a parish might be able to afford for that musician. And then in terms of, what you're talking about with bench fees, there's still the possibility of, and I would strongly recommend, the first right of refusal, that your musician there has first right of refusal over any weddings and funerals coming in. So there's a quality control there too, related to what you're talking about. But this is an interesting perspective that you're offering just in terms of kind of the pastoral nature of the thing.
Yeah. And I think pastors have fallen into that trap of thinking that they can offer a lower salary but have that extra carrot of these weddings and funerals to make up for it. A pastor should just pay the musician what the musician is worth and expect the musician to provide music for all of the parish liturgies. I do think in terms of weddings, they can certainly get out of control. A base fee for a wedding should include an initial consultation and playing for the wedding. But if you are starting to have extra rehearsals, or you need to hire or work with other musicians, if you have to attend the wedding rehearsal.
An endless string of emails about it.
Yes. Although I've noticed that the whole bridezilla phenomenon has decreased quite a bit over the past 25 years that I've been doing this. But it still happens now and then. So, and I think that should be clearly articulated in some sort of packet that an engaged couple receives when they come in, of what you can expect for the fee, and have a little fee schedule of what additional charges might be for additional services, so that there aren't any surprises.
So can I move on to a couple of other topics? Is it reasonable, do you think, that a priest can say to a musician, look, here's the overall financial picture. We want to offer you a salary that you're comfortable with, but we would expect that somehow you contribute to a fundraising picture, in the overall budget. Do you think that that's a reasonable ask?
I do. I think it's reasonable. I think expectations will be different in different circumstances and with different talents and different individuals. But yeah, absolutely. In any nonprofit, a person is often expected to do some fundraising, especially if there's a large project like a organ expansion project or a choir tour or something like that will require funds that are above and beyond the ordinary operating budget of parish. So absolutely, I think a musician could be asked to cooperate or even spearhead a process like that.
What are your recommendations in terms of vacation? I have to say that I have witnessed some very scandalous to me situations where musicians are expected to pay out of pocket from their own salary, musicians that sub for them on, their 2 Sundays of vacation a year.
Oh, that's so sad.
Yes, but it happens, so what are some things that a priest has to think about in terms of, okay, what does vacation actually look like? Can you expect that a musician, for example, hires and tells what to do all the people who will fill in for him on a Sunday? Or is vacation possible when you still expect them to be there on Sunday, but you didn't expect them to be there throughout the week? Obviously I'm saying that last part a little bit tongue in cheek. What are some good things to think about here?
Right. I think many dioceses dictate what a new employee is entitled to receive for vacation. So a new employee in the Boston Archdiocese, I think, receives 2 weeks vacation after the first year or 6 months or something like that. And then 3 weeks vacation after 10 years, 4 weeks after a certain number of years. I think that system doesn't quite work because we church musicians are not like 9 to 5 or Monday through Friday type employees. A dishonest musician could say, fine, I will take 1 week of vacation and they'll all be Sundays. That wouldn't work. We couldn't take 7 Sundays off. So I think a reasonable pastor and musician would come to an agreement that maybe they get 3 Sundays off, 4 Sundays off, whatever the agreement is, and a reasonable amount of weekdays surrounding it, and that it takes place during seasons of the liturgical year where the musician won't be missed all that much. Right. Now, sometimes, you want to go to your brother's wedding or something like that, or some family reunion, and it happens on Pentecost Sunday or something. And so I think a pastor needs to be reasonable and allow a musician to do that now and then. But most of the vacations should take place during the 800th Sunday of Ordinary Time or whatever it is, when they won't be all that missed. And understanding should be spelled out right from the beginning, out in the open, about what happens when you're gone. Do you hire the substitute? Who pays the substitute? Who decides what the substitute does? And you might work for a pastor who says, well, they can just go without music for that week. And I hope, if you're a pastor and listening, that you don't do this, because the consistency from week to week is so important, and your parishioners deserve beautiful music every single Sunday, not 49 of them or 48 of them, but every single Sunday should be beautiful.
Right. And that the pastor also has to think about, in terms of his budget, what does it cost to hire substitutes when the musician is gone? It really is unreasonable to expect a musician to pay out of pocket for his own vacation, because then it's not a paid vacation, right? That's the definition of not being a paid vacation.
Now, if I had a 3-week vacation contract, let's say, and I wanted to take 8 weeks off in the summer 1 year for a little sabbatical of some sort, I think it would be reasonable for the pastor to say, okay, Michael, I'll pay your sub for 3 Sundays. You pay them for 5, or maybe we'll do 4 and 4, because I think it's good that you have a sabbatical. But that all needs to be discussed and out in the open and reasonable.
Right. So let's wrap up with just a little question about what's a reasonable salary? How do you determine that based on experience, number of hours, and cost of living in the area? What are some general ways that you would suggest a priest think about that?
I think the cost of living in the area is so very important. We know that in major cities like Boston and San Francisco, where we live, the cost of a single family home the average cost is nearing $1 million. So a salary for a head of household needs to be substantial enough that that musician can raise a family. That's what the Catholic Church expects of us to do as good lay people, to have lots and lots of children and bring them into the parish. That's a good thing. So where one lives is important. And also the level of academic certification or professional certification is very important. So you would pay someone with a doctorate in music who is a colleague of the American Guild of Organists much, much more than someone who never went to college and maybe has a service playing certificate, if anything. It's reasonable to pay those people at much different levels. And I would say to look at what professionals in your area are earning for who have similar certification and do a similar amount of work, like a nurse or a school teacher would be similar to a musician with a master's degree who's fairly accomplished, maybe a colleague or associate of the American Guild of Organists at that level. The National Association of Pastoral Musicians also has some certification, and it's fairly good. So someone who's certified at that level should be paid probably as much as a nurse or a school teacher, or the equivalent of someone who has a doctorate in that area. If you're hiring someone who has a terminal degree and is really quite accomplished, they should expect to earn more, like the local dentist or the local college tenured professor or something like that. So I think it's important to make those distinctions. And then for part-timers, I've already said I don't advocate hiring part-time musicians, but if you must, try to be as generous as you can, knowing that your musician's going to have to do other work to make ends meet, and that may interfere with the musician's ability to provide services for your parish. So if you want that musician to be around when you need them, be as generous as you can so that they don't have to spend 30 hours a week, pouring coffee at Starbucks or whatever it might be.
Yep. This has been very helpful. And I'm hoping that there are a lot of pastors, especially listening to this episode. But you've offered so much food for thought. So thank you so much, Michael.
Thank you, Jennifer. It's always a pleasure to visit with you.
We hope you've enjoyed listening to Square Notes, the Sacred Music Podcast with Dr. Jennifer Donaldson-Nowicka. For more information about this episode, sacred music resources, or upcoming events, visit our website at sacredmusicpodcast.com. You can subscribe to our podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, YouTube, or your favorite podcast app. If you enjoy our podcast, please write us a review on iTunes. This improves our iTunes ranking and helps others find out about the podcast. The music you heard at the beginning of this episode is Hec Dies by William Byrd, sung by the London Oratory Schola Cantorum Boys Choir, directed by Charles Cole from the CD Sacred Treasures of England. The music at the conclusion of this podcast is from the Prelude and Fugue in G Major, BWV 550 by Johann Sebastian Bach, performed by Jennifer Donaldson-Nowicka. We look forward to having you join us next time, and until then, may we sing the praise of His glory.